How impacted is the human brain by limbic system manipulation? Well, the reality is any part of the brain that is affected either in a negative way or a positive way is going to have cascading consequences for that person just in general. This can present in several different ways, whether it be aggression, fatigue, or even happiness in some instances. There is also the issue of memory recall, and we'll talk about that shortly because in today's episode, a group of botanists, like huge worse than marine biologists, by the way, and I mean, anyways, they create a plant that is supposed to make people happy. It becomes apparent that something is happening to the people after they inhale the spores that the plant is emitting. And with the US in a chokehold of pollen right now, what better time is there to exist to talk about the neurology behind this substance and the pollen it's creating, how it affects the person, and ultimately, does this mean that the plant has gained a form of sentience? Well, let's discuss all that in today's episode, talking about Little Joe. But before moving on, I want to thank you guys for watching. Without you, none of this would even be possible, so I do appreciate your support. I'm streaming over on Twitch under Roanoke Games, and I will be live streaming Roanoke Gaming for members. Probably gonna cover Subnautica or something. Check out Roanoke Tales channel for cryptids and true crime stuff, and also check out the Discord where we watch movies that end up here. Links for everything in the description. We kick off our story with this being BBC.
The BBC.
Which cannot be good, because if my Metro Last Light videos back in the day are anything to go off of, when I used 2 seconds of a hyena clip, I got completely nuked into oblivion with copyright. As the Australians are once again dropping films on us, I'm required to ask once more, is Australia alright over there? Now, clearly they are in England, but it was made in Australia. Interesting. Also, this movie's sound design makes me want to take flight out my apartment window. It's literally tinnitus ease and funhouse noises. As we scan over some plants, we get the title Little Joe. Chris is giving us the rundown, talking about the special breed of plants, as then they talk about how the plants are engineered to make people happy. Plants are typically engineered now to be hardy and able to survive being left alone for extended periods of time so that you can go on vacation and not have your plant die by the time you get back. And that's why I prefer cats. These plants, however, require people to water them and take care of them regularly, and then they are rewarded with a scent. Too much work to keep the plant alive? In my house, it's a husk inside of 3 days. Chris goes on to explain that the molecule that the plant releases is a precursor to oxytocin when the scent is inhaled, the mother hormone, as you know. So evidently, you will love your plant like your own offspring. So prior to moving on, oxytocin is a bit of an interesting neurotransmitter because it doesn't just bond you to something. It does way more than that. It has more functionality than you might know. Known to stimulate the uterine contractions in labor, trigger release of milk, resizes the uterus to its original size postpartum. It also does the aforementioned maternal bonding, trust and empathy, as well as pair bonding. So when you attach to your chosen mate, it's pretty interesting because it has more of an effect than you just choosing a mate. It also affects socialization. So you know when you get like those super jaded people who are like, love is just a neurochemical, oxytocin making you bond. Like you could just tell that they're, I don't know, somebody pissed in their Cheerios that morning sort of scenario. It does more than just love. It does literal socialization recall, and it's pretty important. So oxytocin is known to fire off when you're processing heavy social information and social recognition. And this is going to be important later. Oxytocin is primarily produced actually within the hypothalamus, but funnily enough, even though it's a neurotransmitter, it can enter the bloodstream via the pituitary gland, where it takes on the function of a hormone. This is how it can affect other areas of the body. So what's even better than all that though, is with both cats and dogs, when you hang out with them and you pet them or are friendly to them in general, their brains also release oxytocin as they bond to you and you bond to them. So the love hormone, as it's been called, one of those mechanisms that actually helps facilitate interspecies trust, which is fantastic for Dr. Mambo, Professor Furface, and I, because otherwise it would be a consistent standoff where they're just running away. So if you have an animal that you love, thank your oxytocin transmitters today as well as theirs. So as they continue discussing the plants and their purpose, they are growing the flowers for the flower fair to showcase them, as the cytokinins should have kicked into maximum overdrive for the fair specifically. What are the cytokinins, I can hear you asking? Not to be confused with the cytokines, which are created by your immune system to prevent a pathogen from overwhelming your body, which hilariously, cytokines overwhelm your body. Cytokinins are plant hormones that actually one has to ask, is that the precursor molecule that they're talking about with the oxytocin? Could be, but we'll discuss that later. Anyhow, cytokinins regulate a plant's cell division, growth, and differentiation. And given how fast the little joes actually grow, this would indicate that the cytokinins are pushing the cells to divide at almost like a malignant cancer rate. Cytokinins will trigger growth in every form of the plant, like shoot growth, organ development, and actually can induce resistances to pathogens that may come across the plant. Though, as we will come to find out right now, actually, because I'm about to tell you, a different vector was used on the plant, which heavily affected the plant's genome. So the cytokinins, they're like that for a reason. So leaving the lab, Chris then spots Human Joe out there as he compliments his trainers before cleaning up his hands and leaving. Human Joe and Alice then head back home as he starts talking about how Chris likes her. Two scientists in love, more specifically two botanists in love. If they're like anything like regular scientists, good luck with that. Just a couple of idiots in one area and geniuses in others, navigating interpersonal relationships, which should have been done at a younger age, but because of the intellect they have, it made it incredibly difficult. As Alice then shifts away from that topic, she tells Human Joe his dad would like to kind of hang out with him that weekend. Then he doesn't want to hang out with his dad because he's different from, his mother. Yes, fathers are typically different from your mother. I mean, that's just kind of the way it needs to be, but you do need to hang out with your old man as long as, he's not a total tool. So heading over to a woman who is trying her best to blend in with a chair, they talk about Alice's work. As she's concerned, something could sneak in that she can't predict in her work and in her life. She talks about how her work really does take precedence over her son, and she has this fear that something could happen to him and she wouldn't be there to stop it. Well, likely that is the case. You won't even know it happened because you're not there. Who knows? He could even have a girl over or something with his door closed. Back over at the lab, a scientist named Bella then puts down a towel for her dog Bello, which is a bizarre thing to know, to call your dog. So Carl then shows up to let her in the lab, and working on their tulips, the other plants continue to grow menacingly. As Chris then talks about if the plants survive, they could be in production earlier than thought. They turn up the heat, literally, metaphorically, and again, literally. Chris then makes a pass at Alice and starts talking about how he feels proud and excited to work with her. Brother, you came on a little strong there. He then asks for her to go out with a drink with him, but she can't get out of the room fast enough. Scientist flirting. Yes, very good. This is how it is in real life. Most of the interactions always go over about as well as a wet fart on a first date. So back home, Human Joe then works to feed his ants, who are just vibing out as he's wearing a Kenny shirt, completely breaking lab protocol in one of the most stupid ways imaginable. Alice actually brought home one of her plants. This is just a violation of everything that you would know to not do in a lab. Like, I can't bring home some infectious disease from the lab to my girlfriend like, oh, hey honey, I brought home this Campylobacter that they found on the underside of a toilet in a hospital where people are melting, and it produces a scent of rotten chicken. What do you mean you don't like it? Like, why would you bring home an experimental plant with you? She then runs down how to keep the plant alive as she talks about, well, it's a living thing, so you need to care for it and spend time with it. She's not gonna do any of that with her son, is she? So they call it Little Joe as then they head back to the lab. Approaching the containment area, it's blanketed in pollen. Plant version of Spring Break 2012, it looks like. Most of the tulips at this point have died as a result of this or in the process of dying, as the Little Joes are doing amazingly. So not only is their pollen infectious to humans, but it's poisonous to other plants. This would really be a bad plant to get out of containment. Luckily, we would never do something like that in real life. Yes, anyhow, this makes Carl upset as everyone continues cleaning the greenhouse. In a meeting, Alice defends herself, saying that they designed the Little Joes to be sterile. Carl is upset that his Flash 2s have died, as Bella remarks the Flash 1s didn't survive that well either. Another scientist chimes in, saying none of them have succeeded in manipulating a plant to this extent, so they don't really know what could be causing it. Alice then says she's aware of the virus vectors being controversial, but she used these standard vectors. So yeah, that's a straight up lie, Alice. If you're going to engage in work, then you need to stand by that work. She did not use the original delivery method. Instead, she did resort to the viruses. But we will discuss why that was a craptacular idea when we see what it does. Bella then asks why she designed it to be sterile, as it's not natural. They then talk about the unknown consequences of unknown allergens, so they will be wearing face masks from here on out. So the pollen shows that there's a bit of an issue. Now, it could be a standard mutation that just hasn't been seen prior, but you have two issues here. First, the virus is considered to be a harmless vector for the plant. How this process works is very likely related to CRISPR of sorts. What is CRISPR? Well, strap in because most of you have probably heard this, I'm sure, but it's always worth mentioning more so with the direwolf situation. First off, those aren't really direwolves. They're gray wolves with a few genes manipulated to create the illusion of a direwolf. Definitely a cool thing, don't get me wrong, but we didn't bring back direwolves. Okay, so how do they get like that though? Well, it's pretty easy. Gene manipulation. The old way of gene manipulation was by exposing genes randomly to radiation to see if new desirable traits would form, or selective breeding. Selective breeding is actually how we got dogs today, as we would take the more friendly wolf and combine it with another friendly wolf, and we just kept doing that until we developed dogs. Radiation just randomly broke genes that would actually lead to mutations, and sometimes they'd be good, and most times they would be bad. However, we needed a more precise ability to create reliable gene mutations, which at that point are really not mutations but manipulations. To that end, a method was found, not created created that humanity didn't even come up with. Every day, in the ocean, around 20% of all microbes, including bacteria, are killed by viruses. They get pierced, get infected, and then explode, releasing more viruses. If this were able to be just continuing unchecked, then pretty much by day 5, all microbes would be gone. And yet, it's been happening for billions of years. Bacteria did not just take this lying down. It needed a system in place to identify incoming viral genomes and destroy it, and not really destroy its own floating genes known as plasmids. The Cas9 protein complex was born out of necessity. This protein complex will read incoming genetic material and then perform cuts if it identifies it as viral. This protects the cell without actually destroying any of the plasmids, so it's kind of like a single-celled form of an immune system. However, interestingly, there were other uses. It was discovered that this protein complex could functionally be programmed, and once this was done, the Cas9 protein complex would look for that sequence, recognize it, and then cut it out of the genome. If a new gene were to be placed at that point in time, then functionally, you could outright repair the genome. The implications for this are massive. Any genetic issue that our species faces could theoretically be eliminated. We could become biologically immortal by fixing our genome degradation, and this isn't just an ancient person sitting in an attic somewhere being 300 years old. You would have your body stay relatively the same as the genes continue forming the same cell over and over again. So how do you deliver the Cas9 protein complex and these hypothetical genes? Using a virus, you can combine this with all the information that you need, along with reverse transcriptase, which is how viruses integrated into the viral genome, or at least how they integrate their viral genome into the human genome, and boom, human DNA fix. This process is pretty much revolutionary, and the ability to help millions of people, extraordinary. My ability to talk about it on YouTube, indefinitely. It is highly likely that this method used by Alice when creating the little Joes is the preferred method. But it's clear something was lost in translation for the most part, or something snuck in, as she has claimed. But to understand that, we need to understand more of what is affecting the people who are exposed to it. The next day, the Flash 2s are all dead. Alice gets dressed to head home for the weekend as Chris then asks her again to go get a drink with him. My man here is persistent. Bella then comes in saying Bello is missing, as she supposed maybe she's in the greenhouse. Chris then tells Alice to wait there as she stands there painfully awkward, as the janitor in the background when they're heading towards the lab is straight up wearing BSL-2 PPE while Chris is wearing BSL-1 PPE. And what is the deal with that? The janitor knows what's up when it comes to labs and isn't taking any chances. Entering the greenhouse, he then calls out as the plants start opening up. The dog then jumps on him for reasons unknown, knocking his mask off in an exposure event as he inhales the pollen. I think the dog was being controlled by the plant at this point because it was exposed, which suggests horrible things to the human brain are about to happen. Heading over to the bar, they then talk about Alice's ex-husband, as she says he was allergic to all pollen. Chris then goes in for a kiss that doesn't work. Fatality. He then goes to grab a beer, and as he comes back, he tries to kiss her again, and it still doesn't work.
Brutality.
The next day, Bello is acting weird as Bella keeps trying to pet him as Alice approaches, throwing on her mask. Bello then barks at her as she's now upset, and then Bella is bit. The dog was giving you every indication that it did not want to be pet there, gal, but from what we can see, the dog was having issues with recognition of her, which is not a good sign given the dog was exposed to the pollen as well. Bella then says that's not Bello, that isn't her dog, and Alice suggests the dog is maybe just sick, as it sits there mean mugging through the glass. Over at the cafeteria, Chris gives the rundown on Alice next to Mr. Majestic Hair over here about Bella saying she tried to end herself. She returned just prior to Alice starting to work there, and she used to be the best plant breeder there, but now she's on medication and she's just not the same person that she was. Later on, Bella approaches Bello and then puts the collar on, as then she takes him home. Alice then heads back into the lab as back home, Human Joe is texting someone, probably a girl. As his ants are just chilling, the tinnitus noise starts up again, as then he looks over at the plant and takes a picture with it. The plant begins opening as the tinnitus continues, as Human Joe gets pollened on while he waters it. Just need a bit of hit of that good stuff. Alice then returns home and finds that Human Joe is stuck, sitting there totally zoned out. He doesn't really respond to his mom as she suggests takeaway, but he's already eaten. Also, he learned it by watching you. Heading into work the next day, Bella then says she put down Bello. Well, that was swift and brutal. Alice then says, what does she mean? As she says, they'll all see. Heading to Alice's after work later that night, Bella then shows up to talk to her about her plants. Discussing the dog, she says it was like a youngling to her. Something could happen to Human Joe if Alice doesn't stop. Little Joe affected her dog somehow, and they couldn't find anything unusual with a blood test, as the vet said Bello may have just had senile dementia. Pulling out the kindergarten biology textbook, she then points out the olfactory system and how oxytocin caused the limbic system to react in a way that degraded the brain. Alice then says Bella needs to stop blaming Little Joe for what happened, which Bella says they're talking about a plant. She She's like, if anyone's to blame, it's you. Smacked down. Bella then brings up how Chris has changed, and then she suggests he's infected. Bella knows what's up right out of the gate. Grabbing little Joe from the cupboard after she leaves, she then heads over to her therapist, who once again is trying her best to become one with the chair as they talk about her inner conflicts and how her work is really messing with her. Alice then confirms Chris isn't infected either as they talk if they care about Chris, as then she says, well, I have Joe, so it doesn't matter. But which Joe? Plant Joe or human Joe? So from here, we need to establish what actually are the effects of oxytocin that are considered to be not so great, because those in fact do exist. While oxytocin is seen as a great chemical for social interactions, bonding, and typically is released in an amount that is not like a massive jolt to the brain, it's actually more of a slow, controlled release that allows for the brain and body to utilize it without detrimental effects. However, obviously the pollen is affecting the brain in a much greater capacity. Upon inhaling the pollen itself, the effects are near immediate. Moving up to the top side of the nasal passages, sensory nerves actually stick out at the top, which then connect to the olfactory bulb. Brain-eating amoebas also take the same pathway, so cover your nose when jumping into water this summer. It should be known that the pollen itself is what's said to induce this happiness in people because it is creating a chemical similar to oxytocin, so essentially the receptor that oxytocin links to, this chemical does so as well, and clearly there is a lot of this chemical circulating in the brain, more than what is naturally produced by the body. This would essentially mean that you are exposed to doses that your body was never really designed to contend with, as it moves from the olfactory bulb and then heads into the limbic system where the issues begin to form. Typically, oxytocin will just modulate activity within the limbic system with a focus on the forebrain network where it connects actually with the limbic system itself. And this is how you have like emotional and social behaviors that are influenced, which if you remember our discussion earlier, social recognition and recognition in general are housed here. Because of this, you may know the person standing like in front of you, but you may not remember them or be able to retrieve that information. Actually, this happens to me all the time. Like, you know you recognize them, but you don't know why you recognize them. Now, with people you've met like once or you knew like 15 years ago, it's not really that big of a deal, but your own mother might be a little more concerning, and this highlights what is going on within the limbic system. Due to the dose of this chemical entering the brain that is mimicking oxytocin, it's not all rainbows and unicorn farts. Studies have shown that oxytocin at high levels plays a role in neuronal cell death and actually leads to something like Parkinson's in some cases or straight up ischemic strokes. The process takes place because when this chemical enters the brain, this can actually trigger neuroinflammation, and considering this is not even natural to the human body, it's entirely possible that the body does not have the correct enzymes to break it down. This neuroinflammation taking place in such a critical area leads to a cascade of consequences as pressure is put on the neurons, which eventually can lead to the death of those neurons. But what are those effects? Let's see a few more examples of this progression of this exposure, as it will shed light on what is happening concerning the brain. So being brought in by Carl, he then asks how they could do the allergy tests when they don't even know about the pollen. Alice then drops how she has one at home and they have no allergies, so everything is fine. Immediate firing. Chris then backs her up as Carl says he won't let the plants out until they have been fully evaluated. Chris also planted more of the plants, which made Carl upset. Like, nobody's happy about it because it killed everybody else's plants. And then watching the allergies test footage, one little girl starts talking with her mom about how she's not the same. The mom is about to discuss how she says she was present but not there. She saw what she was doing but not in control. The footage then cuts out just before her talking about how this shift happened. Mr. Majestic Hair over here then walks in talking to Alice about how this is not really the full material. And again, this man's hair is wild. Meanwhile, out in the middle of nowhere, Human Joe then talks with his father about how things at school are going and how just they are in general. He's German, so the pleasantries are a bit more difficult than with other Europeans. I mean, it's not to say Germans aren't pleasant, just if you ever say good morning to them, they will stop and ask you why it's a good morning because they're very literal. Breaking down in front of Alice's house because he was driving a Land Rover, Joe's dad says Human Joe is changing, as Alice doesn't agree. She doesn't notice anything apparently, and for a scientist, she's pretty unobservant. Luckily, Human Joe's dad parked on a hill as he's able to release the parking brakes so that the Land Rover can actually roll off the hill, down out of frame, and then back inside, Alice tells Human Joe that his dad wants him to live with him. Alice then says she wants him to live with him, as then they eat the fish that Human Joe caught. Human Joe then asks if his mom is up for a movie that weekend, as she says she has to go to work. Yes, keep ignoring the offspring. That turns out really great when you're in your 60s. That night, the tinnitus noise is back once more as Alice then reads about the mind. With the added funhouse noise of air being blasted, I have no idea what that's about, and after Alice then goes to sleep, Human Joe enters her room to steal her badge to get into her lab. Meeting up with Selma, looks like he's got a girlfriend, and what do you do when you're trying to impress a girl at this age? Well, you break into your mom's lab and show her a bunch of flowers flowers, of course, telling her to wait as then he heads over to the flowers. I have no idea why he said that. He kind of pays attention to the camera, but then not really, as Selma then says the flowers smell sexy. All right. So Human Joe then says she has to talk to them, as then they hide with the flowers under the opening. Pollen then drifts down as they hang out, and then she's infected. The next morning, they check the camera footage, as then they spot one of the flowers are gone. They discuss if it was maybe espionage, as Alice then spots a foot, and Chris sees it as well. Heading to the lab, everyone looks at Bella sideways as Bella then talks to Alice. Bella claims Little Joe's infecting people to propagate, and then it's forcing people to inhale the pollen. Again, Bella just straight up is on the ball as she tells Alice it is happening, so get comfortable with the idea. So this is in fact what is happening, but how? Well, given that the plant was bred sterile, this looks like a way for the plant to actually propagate. It needs animals in order to continue its lineage, but it needs specific animals, and those are humans. Without humans, the plant cannot continue to survive. So, in order to survive, it needs to effectively have humans bond to it and care about its well-being. Does this mean the bad seed became the evil plant? Probably not. It's actually just purely survival. Now, how would it know to actually do this? Well, plants, if you didn't know, are actually pretty creepy. For instance, how does a plant know to create structures that actually mimic the appearance of a bird to drive away insects? How would it have ever seen a bird with no eyes? It's claimed that plants just sort of take on this form because it worked, but what are the odds of it literally forming a bird that lives in its environment? Not to mention, how are plants even aware of animals in the first place, producing thorns that work or chemicals that are poisonous such as caffeine? Maybe even a scent such as rot to attract flies or nectar to attract bees to help pollinate. The reality is plants use animals all the time to help facilitate their breeding process, and it's absolutely bizarre how an organism that cannot think, see, smell, taste, or anything of the sort, I mean, I guess it can feel, just could do this so flawlessly and just feel out its environment and react appropriately. But functionally, this is how the plant has felt out humanity. Does it understand that it needs humans to propagate, or given its genome was changed, it's just able to more easily use humans to spread because it already had a way in? I think it's the latter over the former, mainly because it seems like to me it's a trait that was bred that may have been stronger than initially thought. Regardless though, the process works all the same. Humans bond with the Little Joe, and as a result, they want to see the Little Joe continue to spread. However, it's not just the chemical that is present that could be causing these issues. Given what we saw with the Flash 2s and their death, it's highly unlikely just to be pollen affecting basically humans. Likely the virus itself comes into play, which is not ideal for the human brain, and this may also induce unintended consequences. Returning home, she then calls out to Joe, who doesn't answer, as then she watches more of the testing footage. It started the day the girl inhaled the pollen. They did the test, and now the daughter doesn't respond to her own name or even recognize her mother anymore. A couple is also experiencing the same issue. The husband doesn't think that this is his wife anymore, as apparently she's happy. What a metric to measure that by. So hearing a noise, Alice then heads upstairs and sees that Selma is over. Joe says, "Oh, we're doing a project together." "Not with that door closed, you aren't. Time to come downstairs and work on that project in the kitchen." So eating dinner that night together, Selma is answering like a robot as she says she's been to Human Joe's father's once before. So this part is sort of hilarious. Like, look, Alice isn't the strongest debater in the world. She's not a master debater, is what I'm saying. That said, she wants to discuss the missing plant having spotted the shoe under the table. Somehow, she allows Human Joe to turn it around as he talks about how he wants to live with his dad. Alice, how do you lose an argument to a 12-year-old? Bewildering. Standing up, he then tells Selma that they're going. "Going where, big dog? You live here." Surely European parents don't actually act like this. It's the same thing in American media, where the parents are about as useless as a screen door in a submarine. But this is just wild to me. Alice then goes to stop him as she gets yeeted, and Selma looks at her like a complete psycho, asking if she can help. So watering the plant, Selma says she thinks it does talk back, as Alice just sits there watching this. Also, all of Human Joe's ants died. Back in the lab, Majestic Hair then goes and checks the samples, finding that they have all died because it's extremely cold in there. Bella is then accused by Chris and Majestic Hair about lowering the temperature to kill the plant. Alice continues running a sample in a centrifuge, as Alice then discusses with Chris about their use of the vectors. She suggests that the plant is infecting people's brain. What if the virus mutated and became pathogenic? Chris says there's no way, let me say it correctly. There's no way this harmless R-vector virus could have mutated to infect human brains. I swear, botanists. Look, man, you're combining microbiology with botany. Maybe stay in that own lane over there. Chris then says their career is over if they tell anyone that they did this, as Chris then goes on to suggest the changes are happening for completely different reasons. Chris says that Human Joe is changing, which is causing her to blame Little Joe. So Christopher, full stop there, my guy. A harmless R-vector virus couldn't mutate. You're serious? The name of the game name for viruses is mutations. So it seems there is a process here that may have jumped species using the pollen. First, the virus was used to deliver desirable genes to the plant. These genes added essentially the coding that would allow them to create a form of precursor oxytocin from the plant to make humans happy if they took care of it. The virus, after imparting this genome, still had to function to do so. So it appears as though possibly its own genome was also implanted. With the viral genome initially kneecapped in the lab to make it more suitable, like concerning a virus to be used, it was then integrated into the plant genome along with the faux transmitter. Pollen particles could have been produced with all of this. The viral genome appears to have been created along with it. So what we have here is a combination of sex chromosomes from the plant, the viral genome, all producing a chemical forcing you to bond with that plant. Now, it is unknown if the virus itself is on the pollen, but I would be inclined to think that the pollen itself has viral tendencies given this method used. Upon entering the brain, the chemical is produced that makes people happy, but it may also be that this virus invades the neurons as well. Once there, this may be where the problem really rears its head. The dog was said to have senile dementia, but really it was a recognition issue. This could mean that the virus is destroying the limbic system cells, but this is also probably not the case. Instead, the virus may have implanted the same genome it has to produce this new synthetic oxytocin. And once this was done, this is a process that cannot be undone without using gene editing tools to destroy the gene itself. From here, the neurons may produce this chemical, also further bonding the person to the plant. As a result, they are fundamentally altered and permanently changed unless someone knew this process was taking place, in which case they could have developed a counter to it. But the problem is the symptoms would not be aggressive enough for anyone to really note it as a problem. Instead, people would report feeling happy as their brains continue to flood itself with this neurochemical, but again, this is not a good thing. Over time, exposure to these high levels may propagate the plants, but it would also induce neuroinflammation and brain death. This is likely not the intention of the plant, but an unintended consequence of this infection. Ultimately, if humanity didn't understand it was being affected because those who were affected wouldn't really care, this could lead to the human race really contending with an issue of longevity, which could lead to the extinction of both humans and this plant. Now, this is a possibility, but it's also possible it wouldn't be that bad. Instead, the brain itself would receive levels of this feel-good chemical consistently, but not enough to induce this inflammation, but still love the plant too. It also appears regular human feelings to a degree are still somewhat intact, as Chris does still go for Alice and Human Joe for Selma, but are their intentions genuine? And the real question is, at what point does this even matter? Yes, feelings are important, but it's sort of like with depression, right? The feeling of sadness, most people would say, I mean, it's the worst part of depression, but it's real, but you're being forced to feel it, I guess is the best way to put it. And if you weren't depressed, then you wouldn't feel sad. So it's about addressing the actual issue, not the symptoms. However, the person experiencing the sadness, wouldn't be able to see past that. And this kind of gets more into like the emotional portion of the brain, and like the philosophical questions concerning human functionality and issues relating to the brain itself. But either way, it's probably not a great thing to have pollen screwing with your ability to think and plan. So over at Human Joe's school, the funhouse noises continue as then she waves at Human Joe, who looks directly at her, but apparently he doesn't recognize her, and then seemingly he just kind of walks off. Getting in the car, he finally shows back up saying he didn't see her parked there. Alice took the weekend off to kind of hang out with Human Joe, as he says he's busy and he doesn't have time to discuss everything with her. This does kind of highlight another issue. While the brain in general should be able to work in a way that allows for it to recognize the world, which is important, it appears to be having trouble. This does highlight the negative aspects of the pollen, which really could be brain inflammation. Back in the lab, Bella is working on her own projects as Majestic Hair then comes in saying, okay, this is how they said it, right? He says that, he's like, my girlfriend is in the hospital and I need to go. Like, why do they make him sound like that? Anyway, she agrees to close up the greenhouse for him that day, as then she heads in with his badge. Also, he's like, oh, thank you, Bella. It's fromage. Like omelet du fromage. This movie is screwing with me. Security rules are extremely lax around here also. So watering the plants, the lights then cut on as she's watering the little Joes. Wrapping up, she finds the door won't open. The little Joes then start making money moves, and then she crawls out the top window to escape their pollen. The funhouse noises also keep going absolutely ham during this point. I have no idea why. The next day, Bella then approaches the plant house or plant house building, as Alice then asks if she's okay, with Bella saying, it's all in my mind. Walking away from Alice, she says she inhaled some of the pollen herself and it couldn't harm anybody. It's just a plant trying to survive. She's obviously lying. Heading back to the camouflage therapist, she then discusses how she used the virus to make the plant and how everyone is changing and infected. And this isn't disturbing to the therapist in the slightest. The therapist then relates all this to Human Joe changing and how Alice is upset. After Alice leaves, the therapist then leaves a recording of how Alice wants to free herself from her bond with Human Joe on a unconscious level. Heading home, she then sees a man in her home, which looks sketch as someone is walking by, and heading inside, it's Chris, as he's telling Human Joe and Selma that they need to appreciate Alice more. Alice then asks what Chris is doing here, as Human Joe asks if Chris can stay for dinner, and she's like, nah dude, so she kicks him out, as Chris then says, well, I think I love you, and that you really need to let Human Joe go as he's changing. Alice then requests to talk to Human Joe, given how many things are disturbing here, and once again, Alice allows an argument with a 12-year-old boy to be won, which is absolutely crazy. Human Joe then says they wanted his father to inhale the pollen too so that he would become like them. Human Joe is quite literally telling the truth to Alice, but she doesn't believe it. He then breaks out saying, oh, it's just a joke. Alice then requests what gave them this idea, as they say Chris told them. Selma kind of laughs at her, which I think at this point would be like, all right, Selma, hey, time for you to get out of my house. So Human Joe then says he just wants to spend time with his father, as Alice then dons her best Kill Bill outfit and walks around the house as the funhouse noises also start up again. Seriously, if you haven't seen this movie, go listen to the soundtrack. It's insane. So, calling out for Human Joe, he turns up as then she hugs him, but bro is completely zoned out. The next day, Alice confesses to Carl that she didn't use the usual vectors, but instead the viral vectors. He says that's a serious offense, but in his opinion, everyone would be using it sooner rather than later anyhow. And also, if you didn't want people using it, why do you have it on site? Alice then tells him which one she used and suggests maybe it has a pathogenic effect on the brain. She says everyone is changing in an imperceptible way and that they feel happy. She says everyone is losing their genuine feelings, as Alice then says they need to sequence the whole genome and then send it to GeneX. Carl really isn't that interested in it, as he's been affected by the pollen at this point. So getting the samples ready, Bella continues watering her flowers as she waves at Majestic Hair, as the tinnitus then ramps back up. Grabbing a ball from Bello, she then looks around and can't hold it anymore as she starts crying over it. It's called a quiet cry. You should invest in that knowledge. Everyone then looks at her knowing that she's not happy, as then everyone heads to the cafeteria. And I also have a question. What is up with the British? Basically their media being forced happiness. Standing up, she then gives a speech about her dog and how everyone is changing. She says she didn't breathe in the pollen and how they are all gone, they just don't know it yet. And after that, Carl and Chris go to confront Bella as Majestic Hair stands in the way of Alice going to check on her. Get out of the way, bro. Giving chase, he then hears a yell and a thud and finds Carl and Chris sitting near the ledge. They pushed her off, and the absolute mad lads probably should go to jail. So Alice then runs away as Chris looks at his handiwork. Carl engages in a meeting after that about the passing of Bella, and nobody's investigating this. He says they must carry on, and we'll just circle a internal newsletter as to what happens, and they start congratulating one another about how little Joe doesn't trigger any allergies and they will be ready for the flower fair. Carl then apologizes to Alice about how little Joe is actually harmless, and he stopped the sequencing of the genome of the flower because we don't need GeneX knowing about it. Alice then brings up the risk of infection as meekly as possible, as Carl then says, well, who can prove the genuineness of feelings anyways? So, I mean, there's no symptoms. Alice then says, well, everyone should be fine, as then she heads out. Leaving for the day, Alice then heads into the greenhouse and lowers the temperature to try to kill off all the little Joes. Chris then shows up asking her what she's doing there so late, as he asks if she's going to do something rash. He says, wow, it's chilly in here, as then he says she just needs to trust him. He requests the key to turn back up the temperature, as it then turns into a sibling fight for the remote control, as then it progresses into pretty much what happens with all sibling fights for the remote control, with someone getting punched. In this case, Alice. Taking the key, Chris then turns back up the temperature and then takes off Alice's face mask, allowing her to be infected. The next day, Carl then comes in saying Little Joe has been nominated for the European Health Award, as the plant will be improving classrooms and hospitals nationwide. Little Joe's evidently their finest work, as they have champagne in a lab. Horrible idea, but alright then. Toasting their drinks, Alice is obviously infected, as Chris then apologizes because he got so angry, as he says, I still respect you. So she makes out with him as he grabs her forearm, the most sensual part of a woman, as now we jump over to home once more. Alice and Human Joe are eating takeout once more, as Alice discusses how it's fine if Human Joe wants to go live with his human father, as the plant then sits there menacingly. Heading back out to his dad, she then drops him off as she has work to do. She walks past the broken down Land Rover in the driveway, as then she heads to the predator therapist hiding in her chair once more. She reports that they had the sequencing done and it's totally fine. She says maybe she unconsciously wished for Human Joe to go live with his father rather than her, as the tinnitus flares up once more. The man downstairs then sniffs the plant as Alice walks out, and getting ready for Kill Bill Volume 3, she heads to the plant room, looking at it and talking to it, confirming she is indeed infected as the plant then whispers goodnight to her as well, and thus concludes Little Joe. Also, there is a song at the end in the credits that is absolutely insane, about as crazy as the rest of the sounds and music in this movie. Go watch it. And thus concludes Little Joe. I do believe the virus itself must be in the pollen that is spreading. This really does have a pathogenic effect on the brain, leading to the inflammation seen, but the symptoms are experienced as pleasant rather than horrific, which would cause them to promptly investigate it. As a result, the plant just wants to live and the virus just wants to spread, all by human hands and human brains. Would this be a massive issue? Very likely. As stated, prolonged exposure to this level of chemical can induce brain death, and it's very likely the virus is also not doing the neurons any favors. Also, it does appear that it can force fire neurons, because we hear at the end that the plant does whisper to it, and others did confirm that they did hear the plant inside their head. This would indicate that the temporal lobe is being affected as well, which means it's not just confined to like the frontal lobe and the limbic system, it is actually infecting all areas of the brain. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. Do you guys think humanity is totally boned? Let me know down in the comments. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, Roanoke Tales, and Roanoke Games link where I live stream in the description. But speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. At the astrophysicist tier, we have Death's Dancer. Thank you, my guy. At the full-fledged scientist tier, we have Dakota 23, Invictus Echo Metric System. Ocean Gate was a cover-up for an anglerfish attack. Official Texan and Stutz. Thank you guys as well. And the rest of my patrons, I do appreciate your support. It goes a long way towards helping out, so thank you. All right, that's gonna do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.